me once again officially welcome everybody to today's event, sponsored by the Conservation Finance Forum, Climate Change in the North American West. This event is assisted by the Ash Institute's Government Innovators Network, and I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Jim Levitt, who is the Director of Program on Conservation Innovation at the Harvard Forest.
Thank you, Jim. This is Jim Levitt. We're once again talking to all of you from the Ash Institute for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. It's fall in Cambridge right now, and we've got the yellow and red leaves outside of the window. And we are honored today to have two very distinguished guests to talk about politics and technology behind adaptation to climate change in the North American West. This is really a continuation of the discussion that we've been having over the last several quarters on these internet broadcasts of the Conservation Finance Forum. That is, recently we talked about the cap and trade legislation that is still working its way through the United States Congress. Today we're going to focus a little bit on what will underpin such markets once they are created, my guess is in the next year or so. So we have two guests today, both of which have recently been honored for their work. The first guest that we will talk to is Anthony Morse, known as Tony. Tony and Rick Allen in Idaho spearheaded the invention of a remarkable program called Metric that is a satellite-based tool that allows water use administrators in state governments and in nonprofits and in the private sector to have a very accurate picture of consumptive water use in any given growing season in the United States as we go along, so in almost real time, as well as an ability to compare that to consumptive water use on a field-by-field basis going back over the last 20 years. So it is effectively an analytical time machine that will do a great deal to inform carbon markets as well as water markets. And that program was recently awarded a Innovations in American Government Award by the Ash Institute at the Kennedy School. And there was a recent article on the program in the Washington Post, which is in the resources section of the website that you can check. It's really a very nice treatment and explanation of how all of this works. Our second guest is Bill Turner. Bill comes to us from the other side of the U.S.-Canadian border in the northwest part of the United States and southwest part of Canada. Bill is the Executive Director of TLC, or the Land Conservancy of British Columbia. Those of you from British Columbia have seen him in the newspaper recently for his part in the efforts to straighten out the control of TLC, and that's an interesting story of itself, probably one that we won't go into a great deal today. But Bill also was recently named as a member of the Order of Canada, which is the highest award that the government of Canada bestows on its citizens for lifetime achievements. And Bill's work in conservation in British Columbia is legendary and has had a profound impact literally on the landscape and on the map of British Columbia. So we are very happy and honored to have both of these guests. I should add that Bill is going to talk about an international declaration that he's involved with that I won't go into too much detail except to say that nations from all over the world are urging the governments of the world to take dramatic and definitive action on climate change as they get ready to go to Copenhagen later this year. So with that, Tony, let me turn to you first and just briefly have you tell us a little bit about how you got into being interested in using imagery to track water use, and that'll be a good introduction to your slide package.
Okay, that sounds fine. Good morning, Jim, and good morning to everyone out there on the internet. how did we get interested, or how did we begin all of this work? It really is a marriage, or it was a marriage of opportunity and need. Idaho Department of Water Resources has used evapotranspiration data for a number of applications, particularly hydrologic applications, going back many, many years. But we were hampered by the fact that we never got actual evapotranspiration. We could only compute potential evapotranspiration, and only on a county-by-county basis. So the data were fairly crude in terms of their spatial accuracy. And initially, and I probably shouldn't go into the whole story, but I mean, just because it takes a long time. But we had the opportunity to get some money through Raytheon, some NASA money, to do some remote sensing research, and we decided that the best thing we could do is try and figure out a way to use Landsat, which was a data source with which we were very familiar, to try and map evapotranspiration, because that would give us a much better spatial accuracy than we had in the past, since a Landsat pixel is 30 meters by 30 meters. And as luck would have it, Dr. Rick Allen at the University of Idaho is a specialist in evapotranspiration, and we got together with him, and he had some ideas. We submitted a proposal. It was funded, and we were on our way from that point. I think the utility of evapotranspiration is well illustrated by the fact that today the Idaho Department of Water Resources is using metric data, that is metric evapotranspiration data, for almost a dozen different applications, many of those being new since metric. I see you put my slides up, so I assume that it's time to go through those.
Exactly. Good cue, Tony. That's right.
I can take a hint. What you see on the title here is, on the title slide, is seasonal evapotranspiration for some fields in eastern Idaho. And the benefit of using Landsat, or one of the main benefits, should be immediately obvious. Those circles, for those of you from the east who are not used to center pivots, are about 130, 135 acres in size. And so we compute evapotranspiration for each 30-meter cell in a Landsat scene, and we can aggregate up to the field size, up to individual fields. And this is critically important for those of us in the American West, because water is managed at the field level. Water rights are administered at the field level. So it's critical, if we're going to use this tool effectively, to be able to look at individual fields. How do I move to the next slide?
Tony, this is Jim Cooney. If all else fails, I can help move them from here if you like. But you can just go to the Content tab at the top of the screen, and then click Thumbnails, and that should pop up the slide titles.
Got it. Okay. Thanks. What is evapotranspiration? Well, we call it ET, okay, because we don't like to say that big word, and it has a tendency to confuse some people. But basically, ET is water that goes from the liquid phase to the vapor phase. Okay? That is water that's evaporated, usually from the soil, although it can be water droplets that are sitting on leaves, or even the spray from an irrigation sprinkler. And it is water that is transpired by photosynthetically active vegetation. Okay, that's it. And the way metric works, this program, this model that we use to map ET, is very, very simple. Okay, the fundamental principle is that evaporation consumes energy. We have the sun over there. We have the sun, Rn, is illuminating the ground. Some of the heat that is incident on the ground goes into the air, warming the air. That's H. Some of it goes into the ground. That's G. And whatever is left over that's not accounted for by those two terms is, in fact, driving evapotranspiration. Okay, it's very simple, but the model itself is actually quite complex just because of the dynamics and the physics involved with all of those elements. Why is mapping ET important? First and foremost, because in the American West, and certainly in many parts of the world, there's just not enough water to go around. We see increasing stress on water supplies due to increasing population and to a changing climate. And I heard this morning that Governor Schwarzenegger in California is threatening to veto some dozens of bills unless the legislature deals with some of the water issues that they have there. Well, no one can manage what can't be measured. We've got to know how much water is being used and where it is being used in order to effectively manage water or to administer water rights. And that issue, I think, is well illustrated by this slide. This is, for those of you who are fly fishers, this is Silver Creek in Idaho. And in the background here, this is an alfalfa field. And just to the left of the red dot, you, I hope, can see irrigation, a sprinkler irrigation line that's watering that alfalfa field. So you can see from the side of the hill, that sagebrush, this is desert. This is desert. And the water that's in Silver Creek is going to supply the water for irrigation of an alfalfa field. It's supplying the water for the natural riparian vegetation that you see in the foreground, and it also supports a very famous population of trout, which Brian Ralston's fishing for here. Parenthetically, I also added this slide to taunt Jim Levitt, whom I know is a fly fisherman. I only live an hour and a half from this particular spot, Jim.
Well done, Tony.
Sorry, couldn't resist. This is an illustration of the Landsat Satellite, and this is what we use as our data source. And it's pretty amazing in some respects, because Landsat is up there at 450 miles in space, and yet it produces data on a 30-meter by 30-meter basis on the ground. And one image, one scene from Landsat is about 10,000 square miles. So when we produce evapotranspiration data, when we map it, we're doing it 10,000 square miles at a time from 450 miles in space. It's a marvelous thing. And you can see here what we've done with Landsat data for southern Idaho, what you see is seasonal evapotranspiration from agricultural lands in southern Idaho. There's a great deal of agriculture. You're seeing about 3 million irrigated acres in this image. And we covered the whole state, but on a field-by-field basis. Again, that's critically important. Interestingly enough, you can see in this particular field, among others, the pattern of irrigation from most likely wheel lines, big irrigation pipes that are on wheels that are moved every few days and irrigate entire fields. The importance of evapotranspiration at the Idaho Department of Water Resources, I mentioned a little bit earlier. These are all the ways that the department has used and is using evapotranspiration from the metric model today. I'm not going to go into any of these because that would take a great deal of time. There are as well broader applications. There are continental scale models of evapotranspiration using satellites that cover much larger areas, and metric and Landsat provide a linkage to those models based on individual fields. Climate change is an important issue that I think everybody has learned that we have to deal with. Evapotranspiration is an important component of general circulation models. Evapotranspiration cools the planet's surface, and we're able to map that in considerable detail using metric and Landsat.
So, Tony, this is Jim. You've given a very clear explanation of what's a fairly sophisticated technological piece of work. Let me ask you this: if the state of Idaho or a private player for that matter was able to look across, say, a county or an irrigation district, and was able to say that we know exactly how much evapotranspiration and then by implication how much water consumption has occurred on every field in that county over the last year, and in fact we know how much evapotranspiration and consumptive water use has happened on every farmer's field over the last 20 years, how does that very specific highly place-based information help to allow markets to emerge that begin to manage water consumption and adaptation to climate change? What's the so what in terms of conservation finance and making things adjust to changing conditions?
That's a big question. As far as markets are concerned, of course, you can't value something without knowing how much of it you have. The Department of Water Resources has used evapotranspiration data in a couple of different ways, I think, that get at your question. The first has to do with buying back water rights in order to leave water in the river to support hydropower rights and endangered species, that is salmon. The department and the Bureau of Reclamation, of course, were not interested in paying for water that was not being removed from the river. That is to say, wet water. The department was only interested in paying for wet water. And there are a number of different ways that someone can compute much water he's pumping out of the river, and those ways generally overestimate the amount of water. And the department actually used metric data to understand how much water was consumptively used by a series of fields as the basis of negotiations with farmers over buying them out either temporarily or permanently. And so I think that begins to get at the issue of markets. The other way is something that was devised by Dave Tuthill, the former director, which had to do with looking at the amount of water used by an irrigation district within a season. That's about a 2-week lag. And if the amount of water being consumptively used, that is evapotranspiration, was not at a level that matched a nominal year in which water supply was fine, then the director had the opportunity to go to groundwater users and say, okay, you folks need to buy water out of the water bank and deliver it to this irrigation district in order to mitigate problems they are having. The idea being, let's take care of shortages while they are occurring, rather than after the fact when damage has already been done.
Tony, that's very helpful. Let me ask you just briefly to comment on one other thing, and then we're going to flip over to Bill. You mentioned to me just before this broadcast that the metric data could also help to measure carbon that is sequestered or that goes into being held on a particular piece of land because of the water profile of that piece of land. Can you briefly explain how metric might help us manage carbon trading networks in the future?
Sure. If you look at a parcel of land that has some vegetation on it that's being used to sequester carbon, say poplar trees, the difference between the evapotranspiration of that parcel and the surrounding wildland is of course the amount of ET that's due to the what do you want to call it, the agricultural component there of those trees. And because evapotranspiration is highly correlated to carbon fixing, you can get a reasonable estimate of how much carbon is actually being fixed over a particular period of time.
Great. Perfect. Let me do two things. One, let me thank Tony for, in his very clear, measured way, explaining what could be fairly arcane technologies. And let me say that we're going to get back to questions for Tony and for Bill later in this program, and that you all have a Q&A tab on your screen that allows you to email or to send digitally to me your questions, and they'll line up in a queue, and I'll take them at the end of this broadcast. So don't wait until then. If you have a question for Tony that you want to get in the line, you want me to present to them, please feel free to put that in now, and I'll come circle back to that later. Our second guest on today's program, Bill Turner, again, is from just across the border in the Northwest from where Tony sits. Bill has been active in conservation, I believe, since the mid-1990s, and again has been a major participant in a number of very large-scale conservation initiatives in his home province. Very recently, Bill, as a founding member of an organization called INTO, or the International National Trusts Organization, helped to draft INTO's Dublin Declaration, which uses the voice of national trusts from nations in Europe, in North America, in Oceania, in Asia, and I believe a couple in Latin America, to urge the national leaders who will convene in Copenhagen later this year to take specific and dramatic action on climate change, particularly because of the responsibility that INTO's members have to protect both cultural and natural heritage. That climate change is a direct and immediate threat to cultural and natural heritage sites around the world, and that we are looking to the world leaders to help us immediately resolve that issue. So Bill's going to talk a little bit about his experience in British Columbia, about INTO's Dublin Declaration, and then we can take some questions from those of you in the audience to both of them. But again, this is a little bit more of the political side of getting to adaptation to climate change that complements Tony Morse's explanation of the technological basis for that. So Bill, let me ask you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit of how you got into land conservation and started working with INTO, and then proceed to talk about the INTO Dublin Declaration.
Thanks, Jim. I'd be pleased to do that. I guess I got into land conservation in a strange way. I was in commercial real estate and involved in tourism properties, hotels and resorts, and started to realize that the very things that we were taking people to see were disappearing through wrong development or a number of pressures that I needed to get involved in. Got involved in volunteering with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and it was a slippery slope down this road to conservation real estate, really, which is sort of what land trusts do, and I think that's a good segue into how this all ties together, really. You know, the history of national trusts and land trusts and conservancies goes back about 120 years to the trustees of reservations in New England, and around about the same time to a group in Norway that started to get together to conserve pieces of land that they felt were special to them. I'm just going to see how I get to my slides here. I think I just, there we go, thank you. I think I'll be okay with trying to move them now from here. Thanks very much. There's been land trusts and conservancies coming into being around the world for the last 120 years, and the United States of America is one of the largest political areas where land trusts have grown and prospered, and certainly now there are over 1,600 land trusts and conservancies in the United States. There's around 100 in Canada, all really grassroots organizations that have sprung up in communities or being inspired to spring up in larger areas by people's desire to protect things that are special to them in their communities. But these have become extremely effective and a very good method of involving communities in what's special to them and in what's special to future generations in those communities. And it's a very empowering tool that as people get involved in it, they understand what it can achieve. And so you have massive successes like in the United States, the Nature Conservancy, and in England, the National Trust. And the National Trust in England began about 114 years ago and has grown to the size where it now has 3,750,000 members in that one organization alone. And people think of them as a protector of stately homes and castles, but actually most of what they do is nature conservation, wild areas and farmland and coastal. They own nearly 770 miles of the English coastline, for example, and make it available to the public for trails and walkways and so on. So a very powerful citizens' involvement mechanism that has grown and sprung up around the world in many, many countries. Until about 30 years ago, it was mostly friends talking to each other, but there was no network, no way of anybody communicating between these trusts, at least on an international level. And 30 years ago, the trusts of the world started to meet every 3 years in a conference to, again, compare notes, mentor each other, and be inspired by what each other are doing. And that chugged along, but there was no real organization to it other than the meetings. But in 2005 in Washington, D.C., the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the United States hosted a conference attended by about 300 delegates from around the world, and the idea of forming an organization called INTO came into being. And really, I think many of us were inspired by the massive success of the Land Trust Alliance in the United States, which holds a rally every year attended by over 1,600 people from around the continent on a national and continent-wide basis. So INTO was conceived of to provide a network, a way of trusts from around the world to work together and share their knowledge and to share their problems and to be inspired, and all of the mentoring and so on that comes with that. Based on that, we met 2 years later at the next conference in New Delhi and officially launched the organization. INTO, since 2007, has established its head office in London, England. The staff of INTO is very small. It's one person working 2 days a week who does a phenomenal job, and 3 volunteer directors who provide sort of mentor servicing and support servicing around the world. We're very fortunate there to have one of the people involved is a retired manager from the English National Trust with about 30 years experience. A second is a World Bank executive who has retired and who does the same thing, and the third, a retired manager from the Australian National Trust. So these three people are run ragged in terms of requests for their support around the world, particularly in third world countries which are trying to create national trusts now. The INTO itself has 24 full member trusts from around the world, and as Jim mentioned, from just about every part of the world. And in September of this year, we met in Dublin, Ireland for the next conference. These are now happening every 2 years. And at that point, we passed the Dublin Declaration, which I'll return to in just a minute. The real characteristics of national trusts are that they are non-government organizations. They typically look after both natural heritage and cultural heritage, often agricultural issues as well. Typically, they're engaged at a national level, and they're membership-based, so they have a constituency of membership. They must manage some sites to really qualify as a core member, and they often work in partnership with community government bodies and so on to achieve their results. The trusts of the world have been aware of and noticing the impacts of climate change for a number of years, at least since 1995. And in the 80s, there was a hurricane that went through southern England, destroyed a number of forests that were containing trees at least 450 years old. So at that point, it was a freak event. But unfortunately, these days, these things are happening more often. This photograph is in Alaska, where it shows the results of the lack of ice, the impacts of storms, combination of things that are changing, eroding the shoreline, the coastline at a very rapid pace, and actually threatening villages along the coastline. In Asia, of course, flooding is more frequent, and major World Heritage sites are at risk of significant damage. And some of the damage is very significant and very obvious, and some of it's slower erosion effects on the mortar in the buildings, and the effects of mildew and funguses that they're not easily detectable, but when you monitor these things, we're seeing very rapid deterioration of some buildings that are hundreds of years, and in some cases very, very valuable assets to the world's heritage. Of course, we've all seen the pictures of the impacts of storms, and frequently more and more storms impacting communities, particularly in the third world, but also in the East Asia area in general. So in 2008, the National Trusts of the world started to put together a paper on the issue of climate change, which resulted in the Dublin Declaration on Climate Change. And in its short life, in the last 2 years, INTU has grown to get connections and respect from people like UNESCO, ICOMOS, IUCN, and recently signed an agreement with Europa Nostra, which is a group of about 280 conservation agencies working in Europe. And INTU now represents over 5 million members of these member organizations from around the world. So we felt that not only were we custodians of lands that were under great risk and buildings that were suffering from the impacts of climate change and whole cultures that are at risk of disappearing on Pacific Islands and Indian Ocean Islands, we had to use this connection to governments, our partnerships with governments, to make a statement, to bring forward the position of people deeply involved in protecting heritage sites. I didn't mention that INTU itself, among its members, is responsible for over 12 World Heritage Sites. And seeing these impacts, we just had to do something to be heard and to get the message out there. We brought together 18 nations in total to work on the Dublin Declaration with input from the United States, from Australia, from England, from Canada, from scientists who have worked on the Intergovernmental Panel, and put together the Dublin Declaration, which in its total is available online, and I'm not going to expect you to read it or see it here on the screen. Essentially, we asked the governments of the world coming together in Copenhagen to take immediate action to tackle global climate change and to protect the world's natural and heritage culture from the negative impacts of climate change. And this actually has been so far very successful in the short time since this declaration was signed and it was signed in Dublin by 42 countries, and that is national trusts of 42 countries, and more and more are signing it now as it goes forward. The Irish Environment Minister agreed to take it forward to the world, as well as the work that the INTU itself will do in Copenhagen when it becomes the active. When the meeting begins, representatives of the English National Trust and INTU will be in Copenhagen to present this to the world leaders. So this is an accomplishment that I think is unique in that it's brought together the conservation, the grassroots conservation work of organizations around the world, over 5 million members of these organizations, and of course part of the role of INTU and its member organizations to bring it back to its membership, to tell its membership what it's done, to make sure that the membership around the world knows what is going on, what is being done on its behalf in this two-way street of communication. I guess that leads to what it does for us, what's happening on the ground with our trust in British Columbia, how the INTU Declaration on this international level relates to what we're trying to do here to conserve what's special about British Columbia. And so on one hand, we're using the INTU Declaration, the Dublin Declaration, as a tool to educate our politicians, our governments, about the fact that we're not unique, that we're not the only people suffering from the impacts of global climate change, that the problems that we're experiencing have global solutions, and we want our governments to take action, and in some cases we want to support them in the action they've already taken. So I think I'll stop with that and just talk about what is happening in British Columbia.
Bill, let me just interrupt to say, first of all, that the The Into Declaration, again, is on the resources page that you saw when you signed up to join this conversation, and will be on the follow-up information that Jim Cooney sends out after this conference. So anybody who's interested in that can get the declaration itself either through that resources page or just by Googling it on the web. The second question, Bill, I want to ask you to address specifically before we flip over to questions is how, if the nations of the world make progress in Copenhagen and we have a new protocol emerges for the control of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, how might that impact, in your view, the field of conservation finance, of actually finding the money to pay for conservation projects in places like British Columbia?
I think it will have a huge impact, and we're looking at it as one of the most useful tools we will be able to do to achieve our goals in acquiring new lands and protecting lands for conservation purposes. In British Columbia, the provincial government has joined with the Western Governors Association and is working on protocols for carbon offsets that will be legitimate, transparent, and documentable. And we're very close now to actually having those policies defined. They should be released, I think, in the next week or two. They will establish what does qualify for a valid carbon offset. We have been looking at those opportunities for about 3 years now, trying to determine what role that will play in the conservation movement. And the Land Trust Alliance of British Columbia, which is a small clone of the wonderful Land Trust Alliance that exists in the U.S., has actually undertaken a fair amount of research in the potential of conservation offsets, we might call them, that is, conservation agencies becoming involved in carbon sequestration and the acquisition of lands for carbon sequestration, and has taken the lead in producing a number of studies that will soon be available. And as soon as I will be able to send some of them to you over the next couple of days, that will help, because they're so close to being ready now. That work and the establishment of a Pacific Carbon Trust that has been established by the government of British Columbia will allow us a mechanism to deal with the purchase and sale of carbon offsets relating to conservation initiatives. And I guess I've used one example that we've been working on for several years, was the purchase of a watershed near Victoria, British Columbia. And the main motivation of the local government was to protect its water supply. They had a choice. They either had to spend $150 million to build a treatment plant, or $58 million to buy that watershed and protect it forever. We partnered with them to help them put that deal together. They purchased it. They've saved the $150 million they had to spend, had to spend to build the treatment plant to treat that water, and also the carbon that they would be using to run that treatment plant every year, and the $4 to $5 million a year it would have cost to operate it. But taking it a step further, we were saying to them from the beginning, this land, and it was about 25,000 hectares of land, this land has been heavily logged. It needs to be restored. There must be a way of paying for that restoration in the carbon sequestration that will happen in that process. And I think we're going to be using that as one of the pilot projects here to demonstrate what can be done. Spent a lot of effort into the metrics of it, and actually I'm quite interested in what we saw earlier today, and wondering how we may be able to apply that technique to monitoring this. But there's a lot of potential, I think, to allow trusts to do their work and find a way of helping to fund that work.
And I will add to that that it's terrific that we have organizations like Into that can pass these techniques and these emerging protocols from nation to nation, so that they can be rapidly transferred around the globe.
Jim, I'll give you one quick example of that. We were in Dublin, and I was speaking to the Norwegians, who were talking about the problem they were having with the lack of salmon returning to their rivers. And they seemed at that point to think that it was only happening in Norway. And of course, I was able to tell them that 2 days before that, we'd been discussing the same problem in British Columbia on a large tract of land where we have a major spawning area where the salmon are not returning either for obviously similar reasons. You know, it's amazing. We work in our own little enclaves and we don't necessarily understand that the same things are happening in Asia, in Russia, and around the world. So that alone is worth a huge lot of.
Agreed. I'm going to now move us into the question and answer segment of the program. I think we've heard two very detailed, very interesting presentations from two guys who I am getting to know better and better and continually impressed by their work. Let me start with a comment, actually, from, and I hope I pronounce your name correctly, from Dr. Saraba Quatra, and I will just read his comment. I am Dr. Quatra, an industrial design engineer heavily into interdisciplinary domains. I live in Vancouver, Washington, and New Delhi, India. Conservation of hill stations is one of my research areas. Information on INTO is very useful to me, and I hope will be usable to me in the near future. My question concerning SIMLA, S-H-I-M-L-A, earlier SIMLA, S-I-M-L-A, a prominent hilly city in the Himalaya. My question is having to do with that city, a prominent hilly city in the Himalayan region of India. It was historically the summer capital of the British India Empire. About 1/5 of humanity was ruled for them from that place at one time. Recent years have shown, steady loss of snowfall, depletion of available water resources to tourists, and so on. I've been emotionally touched by this. Conservation efforts by the government of India have not permitted undue deforestation, and ecotourism is in vogue there. Still, old people say that the mall and the ridge, which had been seen as snow 20 years back, are now a thing of the past. And I will say that I will conclude that question by saying, is there anything either coming out of INTO or out of Tony Morse's work in Idaho that might inform the Indian government in its efforts to help protect this, what sounds like a very exceptional place? And I'll open it to both of you to comment.
Bill here. The Indian National Trust, INTAC, it's called, has obviously been working on exactly this kind of issue. They're very concerned about these really permanent losses of culture and community. INTAC actually works very hard on preserving the intangible and tangible heritage of India, and they were part of our discussions in putting together the Dublin Declaration. So actually this is a prime example of how climate change is really impacting heritage sites around the world. I know INTAC is doing its best to raise the issue, but I don't know of a solution other than stopping the global warming that's happening. And that's a big job.
Tony, do you want to add to that about how your technology or a sister technology might help in better gauging water flows in the Himalayas? I know that the metric program is particularly well suited to mountainous areas.
Actually, it's particularly well suited for agriculture, Jim, rather than mountainous areas, although it can be applied in mountainous areas. You know, in thinking about this question, I think about the only application that comes into my mind immediately is one of being able to quantify the effect of time difference of precipitation. If the precipitation now either doesn't fall or falls as rain rather than snow, metrics certainly could produce profiles that show that. But in terms of how things get protected, I think that's Bill's bailiwick.
Okay. I will move to a question from Bill Levitt, who works in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Tony, could metric be used to create a cap and trade program for water? Could it be used to identify the volume of water, the sustained yield of an aquifer or subwatershed? If so, one could imagine metric being used to measure the usable water as the difference between the total sustained yield and the metered use by all users. Does that make sense, Tony?
It absolutely does, yes. We've shown that we can monitor aquifer depletion in Idaho, and the hydrology section at the Department of Water Resources uses metric data now as part of its groundwater model in order to understand both recharge and depletion. So I think the answer to that question is yes.
Okay. I have a question. Let me do two things. First of all, let me invite all the listeners who are still online. There are about 35 of you, to submit questions that I can pick from to read to our panelists. And let me follow up with a question from Carl DuPolt from Pennsylvania, who has a question similar to Bill Levitt's, which Carl's comment goes like this: great presentation. I'm involved in 2 watersheds in southeast Pennsylvania, occupying an area of 220 square miles. Most of our work has been advocacy. However, we have large tracts of dedicated lands for parks, greenways, and high-quality streams. The area is near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it has significant development pressure. Some of the preserved lands include the John Heinz Wildlife Refuge in Tinicum, the Ridley Creek State Park, Smedley Park, Tyler Arboretum, and greenways along the streams. What suggestions do you have for urbanizing areas to help sequester carbon? And I'd ask actually both of you if you've got any reflections on this. I think that exchanges not only among rural places and aquacultural communities like those in Norway and British Columbia would benefit from these dialogues, but also urbanizing areas near cities throughout the world. So do either of you have any suggestions for Carl?
I think that there is a huge potential for land trusts and community groups to encourage people to actually plant more trees, to do more local food production, to encourage greenways. It takes an active involvement in a community, but actually the connection of a community in an urban area to realize the value of these things can spawn more protection for other areas outside of those areas as well. So we always look at the urban areas of British Columbia as the opportunity place to get people involved and to get them to understand the values and the need for green space, for trees, and for roof gardens. We're doing a lot in this province to encourage people to build green roofs, to actually put turf and so on new construction roofs to actually increase the amount of foliage because of many impacts on climate that brings. So it takes a little bit of innovative work, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
All right. I'm going to close with one more question, and we're coming right up to the hour mark. It's almost lunchtime on the East Coast of the United States. So let me ask both of you, but to begin with Tony. Tony, you had mentioned before that beyond metric itself, there are a number of opportunities to use the Landsat program, which is essentially a program that uses dedicated NASA satellites to take pictures of Earth pictures that are both image bands and thermal bands, and other bands that I'm not mentioning, to help us think about measuring and managing various ecosystem services, that is carbon, water, phosphorus, nutrient loads, so on and so forth, not only in the United States, but perhaps internationally and perhaps with expertise distributed through organizations like INTO. So Tony, could you talk to us just a little bit about other parts of Landsat and how they might be used in the same direction as we've been talking today, and then Bill, you might want to close by a comment on how that might be transferred internationally.
Sure. You know, Jim, earlier you described Landsat and metric as an analytical time machine. Nothing could be more true than that. Landsat can go back 25 years with thermal data, and longer than that with other bands. And a great deal of work has been done over many, many years by many different folks in looking at the relationship between Landsat digital data and various canopy variables, leaf area index, biomass, chlorophyll content, and whatnot. So the beautiful thing about Landsat is there's that long archive of data. It looks at 30-meter cells, and it covers the whole world every 16 days. The potential for analyzing the amount of vegetation on the ground has been demonstrated. So I think if you're looking at cap and trade insurance issues, for example, it's a really straightforward matter to look at the history of a parcel of ground and plot what has been happening with it over at least the last 25 years, and whether or not the kind of sequestration is going on that someone might be paying for. And I think that gets at your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, do you want to add anything to that before we close?
Well, I agree with everything Tony said, and I can see the huge value in measuring in those areas. And it's useful around the world, as he says. I think one of the challenges in other parts of the world will be access to technology, and that's probably where the developed world and the trusts of the developed world have to provide the expertise and the help to allow the developing world trusts to access this information and actually use it, because it's there, but in many cases they're just so limited in their resources. And yet we need to make sure that they do use it because it will help them in a big way. So I'm quite interested in what I've learned, and I think we'll try to make some efforts to expand the knowledge or find a way of sharing the data.
Great.
Jim, can I add one quick?
Please do.
Here?
Yeah.
Landsat data are available free.
Yeah.
From the USGS, and I think that's enormously important.
I agree. It's tremendously important. The challenge with some of these places, they don't have anybody. They have one staff or one volunteer with very limited resources in some of the developing world. So that's why I think where we have to just almost tell them how and show them how and provide them with a little mentoring to let them use this great resource that's there.
I will add to that if and when we get to the point where these tools lead to the establishment of markets that are trading ecosystem services, where carbon sequestration and water conservation have an economic value, then that in fact is a way that this human capacity, this human capital and technological capacity may be financed to take advantage of this natural capital. So with that, I will thank both of our guests. This was really a very interesting session today. we will be back with all of you next quarter with another one of these internet broadcasts. I thank all of you for your patience and your attention, and have a very good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.